The marble floors of the palace echoed with power, but beneath the silk robes and jeweled smiles, queens bled in silence. In an age where a woman's body was a political threat, menstruation became a secret war, waged behind temple doors, woven into cloth, soaked in ash, buried in shame. No scroll recorded the pain, no statue honored the ritual. But the royal women of ancient empires hid their blood like it was treason. Because to be seen bleeding was to risk losing the throne, or worse, their lives. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and sorrow, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. And tell me, where are you watching from? I love knowing we're exploring the buried past together, across time and space. They were queens of empires, draped in silk, veiled in gold, seated beneath ceilings painted with gods. But beneath the thrones and incense, their blood ran quietly. Not the blood of battle or betrayal, but the monthly tide, warm, rhythmic, and forbidden. It was the one thing their jewels could not hide. In the eyes of their priests and kings, it marked them both sacred and unclean, a paradox wrapped in flesh. In Egypt, blood was a ritual. In Mesopotamia, it was a curse. Across deserts and marble halls, menstruation was feared as much as it was worshipped. A woman who bled could give life. And take it, her touch could purify a temple or defile it. Her body could grant heirs or end dynasties. Her blood was mythologized, medicalized, and moralized, but never spoken of plainly, so they built silence around it. Royal women learned early that power demanded concealment. Their bodies were offerings to the gods, but also ticking clocks of suspicion. A missed period whispered of treason or pregnancy. A stain could rupture a treaty. Their cycles were mapped like borderlines, managed with herbs, cloth, and breathless discretion. Midwives became guardians of royal secrets. Handmaidens carried linen bundles like coded letters. One wrong word could send a concubine to exile, or worse, to death by drowning, sewn into a sack of stones. Imagine being 14, crowned by moonlight and silence, told your body was both throne and threat. There was no freedom in the palace walls, only routines, perfumed baths in cold stone chambers, prayers whispered while hiding the pain of cramping bellies, the dread of a public ceremony aligning with a private tide. You learned to walk slowly when you bled. You learned to smile through iron ache. You learned never to leak in temple scrolls. Gods were painted bleeding light from their thighs, celestial echoes of a woman's cycle. But the mortal version was messier and feared. In some courts, women were removed during menstruation. In others, they were forced to sleep on cold clay floors in distant chambers. And yet, they reigned. They ruled while bleeding. They plotted, they negotiated, they mothered entire civilizations. All while bleeding beneath their gowns. No one wrote about it, but the silence itself became its own kind of archive. Their pain never made it into the marble statues. Their stained cloths never entered museums. But their discipline, their performance, their resilience carved history nonetheless. These women held the illusion of divine perfection, while bleeding behind doors no man could enter. And so, in the hush between rituals, their bodies became battlegrounds of myth, of hygiene, of identity. Not even god-kings could stomach the sight of blood unless it was drawn in war. And so hers, the queens, the concubines, the oracles, was hidden, but it was always there, just beneath the throne. The stone corridors of Thebes were bathed in copper light. Dust floated like ancient prayers through columns carved with stars and wings. Somewhere inside the palace, behind latticed walls and linen screens, a queen sat alone, her skin damp. With perfume, her belly tight with ache. Outside, servants prepared the offerings. Inside, she waited for her body to pass. She was a daughter of the sun god, a living Horus in flesh. Her name was sung in hymns, etched in gold on temple walls. And yet, once a month, she vanished. They called it the time of seclusion. To bleed was to be in contact with powers too wild for the world. Not evil, but untouchable. Dangerous. The priests called it Jesu, impurity, the unclean flow. So when the blood came, she was removed. She walked through heat that clung like cloth, past sacred pools and lotus trees, into the red chamber. It wasn't red from paint. It was red from the stories, passed from midwives to queens to handmaidens. The walls whispered. The floor was cool limestone, always swept, never spoken of, no windows, only a slit for air. It smelled of papyrus smoke, frankincense, and the faint iron tang of something no one named aloud. Here, the goddess became mortal. Her womb was no longer divine, but inconvenient, and so she bled in private. The chamber was silent, but never still. A basin of blue-green water trembled with every step. Linen cloths were folded in bowls of myrrh and date oil. On the walls, the shadows flickered like ancient warnings. Time slowed. She counted days in silence. 4, 5, 7. When the bleeding ceased, her body was bathed by other women who did not speak. The rituals were written in scrolls, medical. Papyri that spoke in metaphors, remedies of acacia, beer, crocodile dung. In truth, few cures existed, only obedience. The pain was endured with straight spines and bitten lips. Some queens bled for years and were never seen again. Infertility was a curse. Blood was both symptom and verdict, and yet the red chamber was also a place of strange freedom. Here, she did not perform. She did not please. No eyes watched. No priests pressed her for errors. No servants brushed her hair into perfection. In the isolation, she could cry without punishment. She could scream into the clay walls and not lose her head. It was exile, yes, but it was hers. She remembered her mother's words. The gods know when you lie about the blood. If you faked it, if you pretended to be clean, the gods would rot your womb from within. The fear clung like the heat. So she waited. She learned to wait, and when the bleeding stopped and the incense was lit, she re-emerged. Hair coiled like a serpent crown, eyes rimmed with kohl and saffron. No one spoke of where she had gone. Only the oldest handmaidens knew, and they bowed deeper than before. Because she had returned, and that meant her body still obeyed the gods, a procession greeted her. Trumpets blared. The priests chanted her. Husband sat high on his throne, believing her body was a calendar for the heavens. She smiled. But inside, she carried the red chamber with her. The silence, the ache, the scent of myrrh and salt. It never left. Each month, she entered it again, even when the doors stayed shut, because even a goddess must hide her blood. The ziggurat loomed like a stairway to judgment, layered in sun-baked stone and salt wind. Below, the city of yore simmered cattle bleated in muddy alleys. Merchants shouted beside fig crates, and the scent of bitumen and spiced oil hung like a veil in the heat. Somewhere beyond the noise, within a sandstone courtyard behind bronze doors, a woman sat cross-legged beside a basin, watching the blood bead between her thighs. She was not poor, not nameless. She was a high-born wife of a Y. Priest scribe, cousin to the king's concubine. She knew her letters. She could chant the Enuma Elish from memory. But she also knew this, that when her time came, the law no longer recognized her face, only her fluids. Cuneiform tablets, cracked with age, still tell the tale. When a woman's blood flows, she must not touch the sacred. She must not prepare food for the gods. Her seat must be cleansed. Her hands must be anointed before sunrise. It was written not as cruelty, but as code, a cold language chiseled into wet clay, hardened in fire. A truth that outlasted breath. In Sumer, menstruation was not cursed, it was simply controlled. A woman bleeding was considered nida, separated. Her body crossed an invisible line, not just impure, untranslatable. So the royal women learned how to vanish. They were taught which oils to burn, myrtle and juniper to mask the scent of iron. They soaked reeds and cedar sap to stem their flow. They walked only in shadow, wrapped in shawls that smelled of river mud and frankincense. Their hands were stained with the same henna used on funeral cloth. It wasn't exile, but it felt like it. Inside the palace walls, silence wrapped itself around the chambers like gauze. Servants knew when not to look. A cup left untouched, a bed left cool. Signs passed like whispers. In the kitchen, special vessels were marked for women unclean. A slip of the hand, a misplaced cloth, and a concubine could be accused of defiling the bread meant for Ishtar. And then there were the myths. The goddess Inanna, queen of heaven, who once descended into the underworld and returned changed, bleeding. Some whispered that she brought the blood curse with her. Others said she bled as punishment for pride. Either way, she became the mirror. Royal women performed her descent monthly. Some welcomed the solitude, a moment to shed their silk skins and feel real, warm, flawed. But others dreaded the days. Each drop reminded them of what they were not: pure enough to pray, clean enough to rule. A woman in bloom could command the ear of kings. A woman in blood could not enter the temple, so they kept records. Quietly, tablet after tablet listing names, cycles, dates. A secret calendar of absence. To miss a bleed might mean a pregnancy, welcome or forbiddance. To bleed too long might mean illness. Either way, the tablets were guarded more closely than battle plans. No one dared to read them aloud. One queen, her name lost to the crumbling script, left a fragment. My body is the moon, unseen when it is full. A quiet rebellion. A poem carved into law. She knew what the men forgot, that power lies not only in the visible, that the crescent moon controls tides, births, madness, and yet hides half its face. She moved like a whisper across the lacquered floors, slow, deliberate, untouched by sound. Her slippers, stitched with plum blossoms, made no noise, but her presence stirred the court like a distant storm. Eyes followed her, not because she was powerful, but because she might be bleeding in the forbidden city. Nothing was truly forbidden, except imperfection. And blood was the greatest imperfection of all. The imperial court believed in ki, the invisible energy that flowed through all living things. Men's ki was strong, upright. Solar women's ki was yin, lunar, damp. And when a woman bled, her ki was considered poisoned, unstable. It could cloud a ruler's mind, dull his sword, bring illness to his line. So the empress, even crowned, was less woman than symbol, a vessel to hold order. A body kept quiet, clean, sealed. Each morning, the court women were lined up, dressed in layers of lavender silk, faces powdered pale as porcelain. A eunuch, old and blind in one eye, moved down the row. He did not speak. He held a scroll and a scent strip soaked in mugwort. His job was to detect impurity. The inspections were silent humiliations. No one looked him in the eye. He stopped before her, bowed stiffly, and passed the strip beneath her sleeve. If there was a trace of blood, even imagined, she would be sent away. Sent to the inner quarters. There, in the cold light of isolation, she would bathe 3 times daily in bitter herbs. No music, no candles. The windows shuttered. Not for shame, for control. The empress's body was state property, and the state could not afford instability. She learned to lie without speaking. Her handmaids folded cloths into her robes, soft, layered, perfumed. Their movements were choreographed. Each gesture carried code. 2 fingers meant the bleeding had begun. A fan tilted left meant it would come by morning. They kept track with red thread sewn into seams, 1 loop for each day. The chambermaids did not speak of it, but they all knew. Survival depended on timing. Some concubines faked purity to stay close to the emperor. Others faked blood to escape his bed. The punishments were quiet. A woman who lied about her cycle could be exiled to a monastery, her name stricken from the records. One girl, barely 15, was caught with stained robes beneath her prayer gown. Her tongue was cut out so she could never lie again. The empress remembered her. She remembered the girl's silence, not because it was empty, but because it screamed dot. She also remembered the scent of camphor and peach blossoms, mixed with the metallic tongue she tried so hard to mask. The way her body betrayed her at the worst moments, during festivals, coronations, the emperor's birthday, pain blooming like lotus petals behind her navel. She smiled through it. She bowed lower. She learned to float above her own flesh, even. In portraits, she appeared untouchable, a face without organs, a woman without weight, but in the dark, she wept into cloth folded 12 times over. She bled into silence. Into history, they called her cursed. Not because she did wrong, but because she reminded the court of what they all feared, that beneath silk and ceremony, even a goddess could bleed. And when she returned to court, days later, no one asked where she had been, because everyone already knew, and no one would ever say it. The palace walls of Jerusalem caught the last light of day like cracked alabaster. Olive trees whispered in the wind beyond the gates. But inside the queen's chamber, all was still. Her body had begun to bleed again. She could feel it. Slow, warm, certain, no scream, no flash. Just the quiet judgment of her flesh, obeying a clock older than kings. She folded her robe, dipped her fingers in water, scented with hyssop, and waited for the summons. They came at twilight. 2 temple servants. Heads bowed, hands wrapped in cloth. They did not speak. She followed them barefoot, as law required, across the stone path, through the back gardens, down toward the chamber of separation. 7 days. Levitical law called it niddah, impurity, ritual defilement. Not sin, they reminded her, but separation. For 7 days, she would not touch her husband. She would not enter the holy court. She would not sit where others sat. The chair must be washed, the bed unmade. Every step monitored, every breath a whisper. She entered the chamber of exile. Small, windowless, perfumed with cedar and dust. A candle flickered beside a basin. On the wall, psalms had been scratched with fingernails into stone, verses about purity, obedience, cleansing. She closed the door behind her and wept because she believed, not in cruelty, but in covenant. She had memorized the laws as a child. Her mother taught her with song, if a woman has an issue of blood, she shall be put apart 7 days. It was sacred rhythm, sacred exile, but belief did not dull the ache. She was still queen. And in her absence, others moved. Her rivals sent messages to the king. A rumor passed through the outer court that her womb bled too often, that the Lord had shut it. She had borne only daughters, beautiful, clever, but still no son, no heir. The bleeding made her vulnerable. Not just spiritually, politically, and yet she endured. Each time, she entered the chamber with a bowed head and left it with fire in her spine. Her body was not a curse. It was memory. It remembered Eve, Rachel, the unnamed daughters who had bled before her. It remembered pain without rebellion, power without voice. On the 6th night, she dreamed of Miriam, the prophetess, exiled for her words, her skin turned white, her song swallowed by leprosy. In the dream, Miriam bled into the desert sand. and the earth drank it with gratitude. No law punished her there. On the seventh morning, the queen emerged in white robes, hair bound, eyes steady. The servants washed her hands in spring water. She returned to the court with the scent of myrrh and silence. Her husband looked at her as if nothing had happened, and that was the part that broke her, because something had happened. Each month, her blood had marked her, not just as impure, but as other. Divinity had not damned her, but it had distanced her dot, and in that space, between blood and law, between love and exile, she learned how to rule. Rome gleamed. White marble columns stretched toward cloudless skies. Statues of gods and senators gazed down with unblinking certainty. Clean lines, rational order. A city obsessed with the illusion of control, even over flesh. Especially over flesh. Inside a domus, behind a screen of woven reeds, a patrician woman sat still as alabaster. Her face betrayed nothing. Her hand rested over her belly, fingers tight, pressing. She had bled that morning, quietly, predictably, and like all noble women, she said nothing. In Rome, menstruation was not taboo. It was invisible. The law did not name it. Philosophers wrote around it. Physicians treated it with vinegar, oils, and silence. It was the ghost behind the curtain, the reason for the curtain, and no one looked directly at it. The home was her stage. She was the matrona elegant, fertile, restrained. Her robes were folded to hide curvature. Her voice was measured, her movements smooth. But beneath the linen stola, tucked between pleats, was a folded pad of wool. She had sewn it herself, as her mother taught her. Not because she lacked servants, but because she trusted no one with her blood. In the villas of the elite, bleeding became a game of logistics. Marble latrines were built with small basins beside them, a design meant for rinsing cloth discreetly. The most luxurious homes imported sponges from Carthage, soaked in honeyed vinegar, inserted with precision. Linen was boiled behind closed doors, scrubbed with ash and herbs. If a stain remained, the garment was burned, because a matron did not stain. Her slaves might, her handmaidens might, but she never. The hierarchy of purity was quiet but brutal. Lower-ranking women shared cloths. Midwives reused sponges. The nobility had fresh linen each day, folded in baskets lined with myrtle leaves. Even menstrual concealment reflected status. Blood was not just managed, it was stratified. And still, she ached. The pain was a dull drum beneath her spine. She walked slowly to the atrium, where the family altar stood. Her husband offered a libation to Vesta. Their son recited his lessons aloud. She watched, lips pressed, face unreadable. She was not allowed to lead the rites today. The priest had seen her expression yesterday, pale, tight. He knew, or suspected not, so she stood behind them, not in shame. In function, later, alone, she leaned over a basin of rosewater. She washed the cloth until the water ran clear. The scent of iron still clung to her hands. She lit a lamp. She did not pray. Roman gods did not care for women's bleeding. She sat on the edge of her bed, carved ivory, crisp linen, and stared at the far wall. There were no red chambers here, no exile, no rituals, just the constant. Breathless pressure to disappear the mess of being female. To remain composed, efficient, beautiful. A woman of Rome was marble outside, but inside she carried hidden stains. Not guilt, but a quiet mourning for the parts of herself never allowed to speak. Because in Rome, there was no word for what she felt, only the silence of perfection. The cathedral bell tolled in the icy dark. Its echo spilled over slate rooftops and stone abbeys, across the narrow, winding corridors of the castle, where the queen knelt bare-kneed on frozen flagstone, hands trembling against a velvet cushion, her breath fogging the silence. She had bled again. It came like it always did, without mercy. She had prayed to the Virgin, fasted for days, swallowed crushed angelica roots soaked in wine. But her body obeyed no liturgy. It split open every month with the quiet memory of Eve's sin, and in the eyes of the Church, that made her unclean, not just biologically, theologically. She rose slowly, stiff from the cold, and stripped the linen from her thighs. Pale fabric, dark center. A quiet blasphemy. She folded it carefully, as if it might speak. In the court's eyes, she was divine order made flesh. The queen was purity, untouched by earthly filth, chosen by God to rule beside his appointed king. She wore sapphires at her throat, relics. On her wrists, she knelt at Mass with eyes lowered and tongue still. She was watched always, but when she bled, she became Eve again, the temptress, the corrupted gate of flesh behind her chamber walls. She lit incense to drown the metallic scent. She crushed dried rosemary between her fingers and tucked it into her underlayers. She whispered the names of saints like spells, hoping their holiness might keep the blood from seeping through. She could not confess this. The confessional was sacred, but even there, the wrong word could unmake her image. A bleeding queen was dangerous. A bleeding queen could be accused of witchcraft, of barrenness, of divine disfavor. She had seen it before. Her cousin, a duchess, was put aside. Not for adultery, not for betrayal, but for bleeding too long. The priest said was the devil's river running unchecked. Her husband annulled the union with parchment and wax, and she died in a convent with her womb intact, but her name erased. So the queen endured. In the winter, she wrapped heated stones in wool and pressed them to her belly while presiding over council meetings. Her face never flinched. In the spring, she passed through gardens, nodding at nobles, even as cramps coiled inside her like punishment. Her garments were altered, double-layered, dark-lined, sanctified by a quiet order of women who never spoke aloud of what they sowed. There was a priest's blessing stitched into every seam. She prayed daily, "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean." But she never felt clean. At night, the wind whistled through the chapel walls. The crucifix above her bed stared down with hollow eyes. She dreamed of fire, not hell, but purification. A place where her blood could flow without shame. The bishop once said that menstruation was the body weeping for Eden. If so, then hers wept faithfully, every month, without fail. And when morning came, and she entered the cathedral in pearls and composure, no one spoke of what she carried, not the folded cloth in her sleeve, not the ache beneath her ribs, not the fear, only the candle flames flickered small, trembling witnesses to the pain behind her crown. She bowed before the altar. She smiled when the choir sang, but inside she whispered, "I am not unclean, I am not unclean, I am not unclean." There were no books, no scrolls, no etched commandments, and yet, across continents and centuries, royal women spoke a language no man ever heard. It was stitched into cloth, folded 12 times, and placed beneath a pillow. It was traced in the steam of bathwater laced with lavender and rue. It passed between glances in mirror chambers, where queens and concubines locked eyes but never shared names. This was the secret language of blood. It began in silence. Not the silence of fear that had come earlier, but the silence of recognition. One woman, bleeding in exile, noticed the way another tucked a sprig of sage into her sleeve. A signal, a confession, a thread of solidarity in a world designed to keep them divided. In ancient Babylon, they dipped clay into rose oil and pressed fingerprints on the inside of their veils. 5 dots. A cycle, a code. In Egypt, women wore copper bangles only during their bleeding days. Among priestesses, the color copper became a sign of seclusion, of sacred time, a way to warn without speaking. In Rome, noble women began folding their stola. Differently on days they bled, a diagonal tuck across the hip, barely visible, but known in Jerusalem. Daughters of Judah passed down a lullaby, soft and wordless, hummed only during the days of Niddah. It became a song of mourning, of waiting, of hope. Even in the cold stone castles of Europe, where theology wrapped womanhood in shame, queens shared this silent code. A thread sewn in crimson into a white underdress, a shawl worn left-shouldered, a gesture, 2 fingers against the wrist, passed behind lattice screens, beside candelabras, behind closed chapel doors. These were not rebellions. They were recognitions, signals that said, I see you. I carry it too. In isolation, they had built an invisible bridge, not just of survival, but of sisterhood. It wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. It passed like breath, like myth, like blood, and though history burned their letters, erased their rituals, silenced their pain, this language endured, not in records, but in rhythm, not in names, but in memory, because long before the world listened, women had already learned to speak in secrets. History does not bleed. Its pages are crisp, its statues polished, its chronicles filled with names of kings, dates of wars, treaties signed with ink or blood, but never that blood, the blood that came in silence, that soaked linen in moonlight, that stained thrones and temple floors, only to be scrubbed away before dawn. No records remain of the cloths folded in shame. No laws cite the hands that laundered them. The blood of queens, priestesses, empresses, hidden in the margins, and on. So, across time, something was severed. Without stories, there is no language. Without language, there is no memory. Without memory, there is only shame. Today, women bleed still, and still they hide. In bathrooms, in whispers, behind euphemism. Still navigating the architecture of silence, laid brick by brick in ancient palaces. Still feeling the ghost pressure of exile in boardrooms, in classrooms, in hospital beds where pain is misread, dismissed, because the past did not vanish. It was buried, and what was buried was not just blood, but dignity. What does it mean? To rule in silence? To wear a crown and feel impure? To give birth to a dynasty and be deemed defiled? To endure agony and have no word for it? They were not cursed, only erased. Their blood was not a flaw. It was continuity. It was sacrifice. It was power without witness. So now we remember, not to unearth the gore, but to honor the endurance, the intelligence, the quiet choreography of survival, because beneath every empire stood women who bled in silence and ruled anyway. Their legacy is not written in stone, it's written in silence. But tonight, that silence has been broken.